Well, hello, come on in. I've been expecting you. My name is Margaret Burdett Barton. The good people here at the Marilyn Adams Genealogical and Research Center in Ameliasburg Village have let me use Marilyn's lovely parlor to share my diary with you today. It's such a lovely room, so many of Marilyn's treasures. Well, where to begin? This whole thing started with my son Thomas Barton. I guess he thought I had lived a pretty exciting life. And well, as I reflect upon it, I guess maybe I have. Anyway, Thomas thought it would be a good idea to commit my memories to paper. So on December 2nd, 1816, that's exactly what we did. So sit back, get comfortable as I read and reflect upon these 81 years of my life from Thomas's rambling notes. I have picked some excerpts to share with you today from the time I moved to Kingston, Cataraqui area as a child, and then moved back to upstate New York for some 30 years as a young woman, until the time I ended up in Demorestville. Here we go. I was born in Schenectady, New York in the year 1787, July the 4th. When 2 years old, my father moved to Canada, my father being a loyalist. Canada was then almost a wilderness. My father's name was John Pinhorn Burdett. He was the son of Stephen Burdett. He was born in New Jersey, Fort Lee. His brothers were Stephen, Peter, Benjamin. Louis, he went to sea and was drowned. Oliver went to Nova Scotia or St. John, New Brunswick. His sisters were Hester and Polly. My Aunt Hester and Uncle Ben never married. My grandfather's name was Stephen Burdett, and my grandmother's name was Hannah Earl. My father was born in New York. My mother's name was Nancy Myers. She was born in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. Her father's name was Richard Myers. My grandmother's name, on my mother's side, was Margaret. Her maiden name I do not remember, I was too young. My grandmother married again, but did not live long. My mother was left an orphan. She had neither brother or sister. She had one brother which died young. My mother was taken by a lady and brought up at that place. My father married her. Their names were Carr. He was a tailor by trade. After my father married, he settled in Fort Lee, New Jersey. My brothers, Benjamin and Stephen, were born there, and Mary Ann also. My father moved afterwards to Schenectady, New York, where I was born. When I was 2 years old, my parents moved to Canada. My father belonged to the Lutheran Church. I was christened in Dutch. The inhabitants of Schenectady were mostly Dutch. I was 2 years old, and it was 2 or 3 years after the Revolutionary War. We moved to Canada near Kingston. We lived on a farm. Here, John was born. Hannah was next. David, James, Oliver, and Rachel. We children that was born in the U.S. drew land, my father being a UEL, about 300 acres of land. We drew land near Belleville to be divided amongst the children. This my father sold and bought a farm near Cataraqui Creek, about a mile from Kingston. When we children were of age, we drew land again. My portion was in the township of Brock. At this time, Canada was almost a wilderness, and land was very cheap, about 25 cents an acre. We did not value land, as it seemed no prospect of Canada ever becoming anything. The inhabitants were deprived of every comfort and suffered for the real comforts of life. My mother often cried over coming to Canada. No apples to get. We used to get thorn apples. No fruit grew here. My first recollections were when a child of my childish sport on the shores of Cataraqui Creek near Kingston. As I grew older, I often worked both in the field and in the house. There were many hardships here in the wild woods of Canada. I had a dislike for washing dishes, so when about 12 years of age, I worked to Barney days, working out of doors most of the time, for 2 years. Then I went home, For my 2 years' labor, I received 3 sheep, 2 dresses, 1 flannel, 1 calico. At the time, Kingston was a village. 2 American stores, very small. The principal merchants were John Size, John Culberson, Douglas and McGee were Americans. The UEL were McLean, Macaulay, and Peter Smith. Forsyth and Cartwright, Americans. Only 1 church at the time. Rector, Carson Stewart. No Methodist at this time, neither showing them to preach here as in after years. They drove from Kingston, which attempted to preach. We had to go to school, 3 miles. At one time, I played truant, staying away from school 3 days and just going home at nights. I did not like the teacher. I was crying to get out of his sight, and he said he would send for thread and needle and sew up my face. I was offended and stayed at home, promising my mother that I would study all of the time. My brothers taught me at home. We had many privations. No fruit, only berries. Occasionally apples, they were brought from Niagara. We had to go to Kingston to mill our corn. We pounded. Some liked a well sweep to pound on a block with. We had sieves to separate the coarse from the fine. When I was about 5 years old, there was a famine in this part of the land. It was called the hard summer. We had scarcely anything to eat. Nothing grew, but the caterpillars devoured everything. We had no bread, plenty fish in the waters, called channel catfish. They were very fat. These fish were our principal living. We had butter and milk with greens and fish, which were our main dishes. Some of our men went to Schenectady after flour, so we had a little. Some families I heard of browsed like the cows do in the woods. We had hard times, rich and poor alike. Our neighbors were kind. Nothing but friendship was among us. No envy, no bickering, no slander against each other. We lived as one family, each feeling each other's sorrows and feeling each other's distress. In the time of need, we were ready with a willing hand to assist and comfort the needy. There was an old French fort at Kingston where the troops stationed. We went to this place to trade and sell butter. I often went to this place with my mother. Charles Stewart built the first mill in Frontenac. At the age of 14, I learned to spin and knit and sew. I stayed nearly 2 years in Kingston with Mrs. I can't remember her name for company. Her husband was a captain up the lake on a sailing vessel. There were no steamers at this time, and bateaux were used from below Kingston. I used to ride for long distances on horseback, being an excellent rider on horseback. I have often rode horseback, not fearing fiery horse at this time. I used to ride a long distance. There were no easy carriages of any kind. I went up to Third Town to card and spin, my sister being there, and I had the ague at this time. My brothers Stephen and Benjamin went to New Jersey among my father's friends and stayed there for some time. At the age of 16, my mother died. My sister, older than me, married. My 2 brothers being away, my father concluded to go and see them and break up housekeeping. My sister was 4 weeks old when my mother died. My mother was the first one buried in the Waterloo burying ground in the southeast corner. My brother John was living with Louis Day, learning the shoemaker's trade. David, with John Cavally at the shipbuilding, his master, ran away. He was with Sam Ryder, learning the tanner's trade. At this time my father was away, and I had all of the children to see to and get them in good places. Oliver and James stayed to my Aunt Polly Day's. They were small children. My aunt was old, so I took 2 children to Mrs. Orser's with me. After some time, I got a place to William Harrington's. He moved to Wolf Island. I used to go over in a small boat to visit him and pick cranberries down the river. Sometimes we pitched our tents and stayed until the next day. James, I got to Mr. Sweet's to learn the blacksmith's trade. My sister Hannah lived with Scotch people by the name of Whitemans. I took the baby with me to Mrs. Orser's and learned the weaver's trade. I was to stay there 3 years and weave to work for my support with the children's keeping. And after that, Mrs. Orser was to keep my little sister for me. I was away one day to see my brothers. I came home to Mrs. Orser, and she said that my bed and bedding and all that I had was burned up. The cookhouse took fire and my things were out to air. This was sad news, for I needed them. I felt discouraged. Afterwards, the hired man told me that she hid them in the barn. After my time was up, I went out weaving and made money. I made it my home to Isaac and Solomon Orsers, taking in weaving until I was 21 years old. I assisted in clothing the children, my sister and brother that were younger than myself. Oh yes, this was something I remember. The 6th day of June, 1806, was the dark day as it was called. It was a total eclipse of the sun. I was at Kingston at the time. I remember the stonemasons were building a house nearby. They came down from their work. They could not see to work. Everything looked sad and gloomy. I was frightened and never expected to see the light again. I wished myself home amongst my friends. I will remember this day. I was 19 years old at the time. My father and brother Stephen returned, and they lived at Solomon Orser's. Stephen worked at his trade shoemaker when the children were young. I loved James, but of all the others as I grew to womanhood that I loved was my brother Stephen. I was more attached to him more than the others. My sister Mary Ann married and lived in Kingston, had one child, Henry Mackenzie, about this time. She and I went to see my brother Benjamin. He was married to Miss Naomi Moore of Fort Lee, where he lived and had 2 children. We stopped at Albany. We stayed to a hotel, a farmer's hotel in Court Street. We concluded to stay here until we wrote to my brother Benjamin. He wrote discouraging letters to us saying he was a new beginner and hard to get along. After this, my sister thought we had better not go. So she got sewing at Mrs. Enel's. One day, Mrs. Enel came in with a gentleman, Thomas Barker, who wanted me to go and work for him. I did, and stayed there for 4 months. While at Mrs. Enel's, our trunk was broken open, and money was taken out. All that I had, it was $40. After this, I hired a room at Dr. Davidson's. Me and my sister took in sewing. In the winter, we went to Heidelberg to see my father's friends, Aunt Secord. They were real old Dutch. My aunt's name was Margaret. They sent their son Ben after us. We had a nice time there. He took us home in a sleigh, brought us a load of wood when he was drawing to Albany. In the spring, I went back to work for Mrs. Germain to do light housework. Mrs. Barclay, her mother, lived in the same house. I had not been there 1 month before Mrs. Barclay's girl left, and I had everything to do. Mrs. Germain had a child. This was up in the 3rd story. My going up and down the stairs, they seemed to think it no work. I felt so lame and tired. I would try to keep up. I thought I should die. I had no rest, no time to do my work for myself. I had to save some grease and set up all night to do my work, for they would not give me any chance to do otherwise. Every night they would come and see that I was in bed. After they were in bed, I would get up and light my lamp and etc. I never forget those people. I would sometimes cry myself to death. I was never treated like a servant before. I used to take my complaints to old Mrs. Barclay, a fine old gentleman. He told me not to work as hard, but the woman laughed at me, and I say, "Well, I was a fine girl to tell stories to this gentleman." I did not like to be changing places so often, or I would have left here long before, and not been so badly used, and was afraid I would be giving a bad name by changing places. At last I made up my mind to leave them. I told them I would leave them. After this, they were very friendly to me and wanted me to stay 2 weeks and help with the quilting. One day while quilting, Miss Lydia Hire and two Mrs. Murdoffs called, and Mrs. Germain told them I intended to leave them. Lydia said that she wished that I would go call on Mrs. Brown, and they would be very glad to have me come and live. The girl they had got married. They had her for several years. I told her I would. In a few days after I called to see them at number 10 Hudson Street, Mrs. Brown was a sickly woman, small and delicate. She told me her rules and that I should be as one of their own family. I went there soon after and found it a splendid time. Lydia and I had good times together. She always helped me in my work, and every afternoon I dressed myself and was well cared for as anyone. I enjoyed myself there, never baked, and had a colored woman to wash. I soon told I would rather have do it myself, for the old wench was rather too strong and smelling for me. Mr. Brown was a merchant, a gentleman in truth. He came to Albany very poor, but became a rich man. They were Presbyterians, but I always attended the Methodist church. Their children's names were Andrew, Mary Jane, and Seneth. Mary Jane died while I was there. She was out where the children were playing ball. A club struck her in the head and caused her death. 2 or 3 of her children was born while I was here. Before one of the children died, I heard a rap at the door, and no one was there. So we all thought it was an omen. And for her youngest, but 7 or 8 months old, the child died. Evenings, I sat upstairs and talked to the children. They liked my company. Used to read the Bible to them and teach them real Methodist doctrine. They let the youngest go with me to Methodist meetings. After they began to grow up, they would not let them go for fear they would imbibe the Methodist doctrine. They used to cry to go with me. At last they all grew, so I had no company. Still, when at home, they would want me to read to them. Oh yes, I forgot. While I was living at Mrs. Enel's, I was homesick and could not sleep. My mind was so disturbed. I thought that I would not stay there long. I thought that I should die. I was so lonesome while I was there. I heard of a fortune teller and concluded to go and see what she could tell me, although I really never believed in such things. So one afternoon, Sally Enels and I went to this note fortune teller, Mrs. Haight. That was her name. She was an old Dutch lady. She could not talk plain, but very broken. I wanted to see if she would tell me if I was going to come home to Canada. The old lady drew the cards and began. "My dear good lady," she would say, "you will live here some years and marry and live here." I told her that I should never, but she told me I surely would, and my future husband that I had not yet seen, he was not far off, and she pointed in the direction he lived. "Set up there," she said. She told me I was 21 years old and I was born not far off, and pointed toward my birthplace, Schenectady. She said my future husband was a gentleman. I asked her, was he handsome? She took her chin in her hand and held it closely and scowled some. I asked her what his business. She said, I asked her what his business. She said now he is writing, but his trade, and she motioned her hand as rolling something. I thought he must be a printer, and she told me that the house that I would live in was white, and after many years I would move to another country and would live in a house surrounded by trees, and that my last days would be my best days. Every word of that fortune came to pass. After I came to Mrs. Brown's to live, Lydia and Mrs. Hire and I dressed ourselves like farmers' girls, wore sunbonnets and short gowns, and in the evening we went to see the same old lady. We could not get her to tell our fortunes. She told us we were from the country, but she would say, "No, good ladies, you must not come here. Come another time." so we had to go home without our fortunes being told. In June, I cannot remember the day of the month, in the year 1816, my sister and I started for Canada in a wagon, with 4 horses before the wagon. At this time, this was a mode of conveyance through to Buffalo and Niagara. We took our provisions with us, and also our bedding. Whenever we stayed at night, we slept on our own beds, also cooked our own dinner. This was the way the travelers usually done. We passed some very pretty scenery. We would often walk for quite a distance. One place where we stayed, we had bear's flesh for breakfast. This was quite a rare treat. The stopping places on the road, cannot remember them all. We overtook a family traveling from Albany bound for Canada. We stopped our team, took out our provisions, and gave them a share, they being poor. This was a beautiful place in the edge of the woods. We parted never to meet, bidding a goodbye. I remember passing through the 9-mile woods at this place. We picked a quantity of berries, also saw some wild deer in the road ahead of us. Some of the road through the woods was made of logs. The bridges were very shackly and looked dangerous, also very deep gulches with streams running. I remember passing through Martinsville and Brownsville. We stopped to Mr. House's hotel keeper. He seemed to be a very good, friendly man. 2.5 miles from this place, there was a very steep hill. It was a sight to look at. At the end of the week or more, we arrived in the village called Sackett's Harbor. I saw where the large boat was building. Also, some of the American soldiers were stationed there. We left Sackett's Harbor, got weather-bound, and stops on the boat we took passage on was a sailing boat, not very large. Mr. Cherry was the captain. We stopped on an island while we were here. We all went to a quilting bee, and a good time was had with all the inhabitants. Next morning, early, we took the boat for Kingston. Got to Kingston late in the afternoon. We put up at Gare Landing. While here, Mr. Williams Carroll called to see us, being acquainted with us in Boston. He was very friendly and wanted us to go to his boarding house. Early next morning, we got aboard a sailing vessel, there being no steamers here. The captain's name was Bill Yurts. Our passengers were George Kingsley's mother, Mrs. Ayres, 3 men, and my 3 children, Mary Ann and myself. We passed up this beautiful bay very quietly. It took us from before daybreak until just after sundown. We reached the 6th town and landed at Conger's Mills. Mr. Yerkes took our trunks to Mr. Conger's. Here we could not get a conveyance. We then went to Mr. Goldsmith's. We met him walking out with his lady. He was just married to his 2nd wife. He told us that he could not bring us to Demorestville and said we must stay all night with him. Mr. Conger had a mill here at the time. Mr. David Goldsmith treated us very kindly. He told us he would go with us and help us, but we concluded in the morning that we would try all of the neighbors on the road at this time. We could not get any conveyance at Granny Fraser's. Mr. Joseph Gerard overtook us and said that he would hurry on and tell our friends of our coming. 2 men working there were Rate and Rastus Howard. They seemed like our brothers, so glad to see us. This was the first time that I had ever seen them. On the long bridge, Uncle David met us on horseback. He took the children on horseback. We walked the rest of the way. When we got to Hannah's, she seemed so pleased to see us, for she loved her sisters. The first house in the village where Mr. Bradshaw lives, where the church stands, Uncle David had a house. There was a frame house where the Mordens Hotel is now, and Uncle Demarest's house. The mill was opposite to the street that leads to the Episcopal Church. Where Henry Dunning lives was a distillery owned by Major Howell. This is a building that were here at the time. The sawmill was over the creek where the mill now stands. The preacher of the circus was Thomas Madden, and Guillaume Demarest used to gather his neighbors together and read them some sermons that he had in his possession. The preaching was at Guillaume's kitchen. The kitchen was well filled. My first 3 children were christened by Reverend Maddens. H.M. Barton by Elder Case, S.S. Barton by Flint. The others I cannot remember. They were all christened. This I attended to at the time, being a duty for that God required of me to put them in good hands. They were working here at the time. Mr. Spur, millwright, Barker, a laborer, and 4 others, all employed by Mr. Demarest. Flour was $20 per barrel, and pork the same price. All provisions were very high. Not much clearing below the hill. It seemed to grow very fast, though, after we came here. The neighbors around the country were Reitmeyers, Eatons. S. Burdett lived on John Allison's farm. On the island were Van Meers, Thompsons, and Parks. We used to go to singing school to Aunt Ollie's. Old Major Howell lived on the island also, where J. Moran owns. The scattered tribe of Massasaugas were plenty around these parts, but harmless, and not any was savage. Smith's had a mill where he owns now. He had a mill before Mr. Demarest. Uncle David boarded with Mr. Hill, the first that was sold to Squire Coles, the day H.M. Barton was born. This was 1816. Guillaume Demarest had set up the first house in 1793. Now there were 4. The part below the hill was woods. Soon after this, more Americans came, such as the Howards, Reitmeyers, Eatons, and Thompsons. At first, the place was all Yankee, and so for many years remained. When the first Corners went to school, they were almost all Americans. On the 4th of July, there was always an American flag flying from the tall pine trees over the woods. After the Bartons came here, the place seemed to grow very fast. A mill had been built on the creek running northwest from Fish Lake and into the Bay of Quinte. Soon, other mills were put up. A distillery owned by Major Howell was in operation about this time. It was situated on the hill across from Mr. Walker. Demarest-ville's growth was a little short of phenomenal. In Demarest-ville, there were 2 sawmills, an ashery operated to ship potash. There were 5 mills, a cooperage owned by Mr. Gardner's, which was set up on the top of the Cooper Shop Hill, carding and fulling mills owned by Mrs. Stotts and run by R.J. McDowell, which in later years was torn down by William Crow and made into a cow stable for his farm. There were blacksmith shops, shoemakers, and also a tinsmith shop. Baker's Furniture Store and Mr. Baker had a bakery where Ed Carter's store now stands. The common school was the little brick cottage, which was owned by the Presbyterian Church and later torn down. The first grammar school was here also. There was also a plaster mill. The Presbyterian Church was where the evaporator stood. The Albion Hotel, where Mr. Sallins had his black shop, Noston Sprague and R.J. McDowell keep store where Clayton Ryan lives, also in the later years being the town hall. There was a street running by the side of the mill pond. There was also a house on the little island in the center of the mill pond. The boats used to come into Big Island Bridge for ashes. It was a log bridge at the time. There were 3 hog yards, Noston Sprague being called the Hogs King. There were also 2 bands. There was a large hotel on the lot below Mr. Walker's. There was a drugstore in the corner of the same lot. And in early years, the soldiers were trained there. There was a store in the house where Mr. Doney lives, run by Ed Nixon. The sawmill was run by Mr. Baker. I'll finish up with the story of the witch doctor of Fourth Town. At this time, Dr. Miller was called on to Dr. Kate Alexander. The neighbor thought that she was a witch. The reasons were founded. Her cleaning and decorating her house. It seems when she was cleaning her house, in one room she whitened the wall, and afterwards she took a bluing bag and daubed the bluing all over the wall. This was done before she was the witch. This way of decorating a room was something new in those days. The neighbors would not follow her style of house cleaning for fear of bringing on the witches. The method that the old doctor used was this: to cut a piece out of the bosom of her shimmy, being a certain cure. He seldom made a second visit. Besides, he would talk over some words, such as were the superstitions that were among the people. Stephen Burdett had a daughter that was taken with fits. He was recommended to try the witch doctor. His neighbors advised him, for they thought she was bewitched. The doctor gave him a writing not to be opened. On his return home, he found his daughter was better. About the same time he received the writing. I have this story truly written. My children also kept journals and diaries of the day-to-day life in Prince Edward County. There are several diaries in the Barton collection. My diaries cover the years 1848 to 1897. My son Thomas Barton was active from 1869 to 1887 and 1886 to 1890. My son Ira kept his journal from 1878 to 1891. Now, the good volunteers at the Marilyn Adams Genealogical Research Center have carefully preserved the original diaries. And not only that, they have reproduced them so that they are more easily handled and readable. I've been told that this is probably one of the oldest first-person records in all of the collection here at 7th Town. Well, let's flash forward to 2021, COVID haircut and all. I am Beverly Sprague, a 7th generation resident, as well as being a volunteer. I am the current president of the 7th Town Historical Society. We hope you will check us out on Facebook or drop by the Marilyn Adams Center when we can safely do so and have a look through our vast collection of materials. Volunteers are always welcome. There are a wide variety of jobs that need attention to keep our doors open and the stories and histories of hundreds of families that are housed in our collection.